Good morning. Welcome. It is Sunday, the 10th of February in 2019. The lectionary epistle text for today comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. I will use the Revised Standard Version for the reading. This is the Apostle Paul speaking to the church at Corinth. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which also you stand, through which also you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you've come to believe in vain. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as to one aborted or miscarried, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of those, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is in me. Whether then it was I or they. So we proclaim, and so you came to believe. Good morning, everybody. So I looked at the gospel text for today, and it's a fun text. It's a story in Luke 5 of Jesus and the fishermen, and they're out at sea, and they don't catch any fish, and Jesus tells them, where to go catch the fish, and they do, and they're overwhelmed, and Jesus says, look, I'll make you fishers of men, and all that. And the problem that I have in preaching that text is it's loaded with any number of issues, but the primary one is going to be, how does Jesus know where the fish are? And it's a legend, it's a myth, it's a fake story, and all this and that and the other. And rather than get in and try and gut it out so that the liberals and progressives could have a better worldview, I was thinking, well, I could share stories from the shamanic training that I've been in for 16 years on how you know things like that, how you know where you walk into a forest, and you can know how far and in what direction the nearest deer is. And there are actually exercises you do in the upper level courses where you discern the nearest animal, or do you pick an animal like a deer, or if you're you can pick any kind of animal you want. And then you go confirm it. You go until you find the tracks that lead to that spot, and you can go to that spot, and typically you've scared the animal away, but you can see that they literally have just been there within minutes of your arrival. So can you know where things are? Yes. Is it possible? Yes. And I said to myself, I am not going to deal with this text. No way. So I'm going to pick 1 Corinthians 15. It's much more interesting, and it has to do with the larger thesis that I'm developing. And I will apologize here. I have to blow my nose. I'm going to leave the screen. I apologize. There, I'm sure you all heard that, the cry of the wild moose. It was just 3 feet away from my desk. Okay. In 1 Corinthians, we're looking at a letter written to a church that has a major conflict with the Apostle Paul. And the reason they have a conflict is that there are other missionaries that have come through that congregation. We know of Apollos, he came through. So did Peter the Apostle, he came through. And so did others. And the Corinthians were hearing mixed messages about Paul and his message. And he is going to have to battle for his apostleship in this letter. In fact, the great letters of Paul, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, which are written in the years 50, 51, early 52. And again, I'm going to follow Doug Campbell's chronology in this. But in these letters, which are post-Antioch, of course, and post Paul's time in prison when he had written Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon and Philippians. These letters, the great letters, Romans, the Corinthian correspondence, and Galatians, all reflect the challenge that Paul is facing to his apostleship. That challenge is both old and new. We see the same challenge today in the church when people say, oh, I don't follow Paul, I follow Jesus. And we've seen the rejection of Paul. He is known as the myth maker of Christianity, from the history of religion school all the way back in the 19th century until today's modern atheists and agnostics. And the fact is, Paul got the revelation. He understood something. He saw something. It's not a mistake to note that virtually every single book of the New Testament, in one way or another, is wrestling with Paul. The Gospels and other letters. So when Paul is in Corinth, at this point, he's having to justify what has happened with his message, because his message has changed. And his interlocutors are grabbing onto that for everything they've got. And they're saying, Paul is fake. He taught you one thing because he used to teach it, but now he's teaching you a different thing. And so he's fake. And if you go look at Paul's true emotional response, in a sense, in 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13, you will find that in the second letter that Paul writes to these Corinthians, he refers to these other missionaries that have come through as servants of Satan. In other words, there is a clear demarcation between Paul and his understanding of the gospel and what these others are bringing to Corinth. Now, we don't have to imagine what that is. It's pretty clear from the letters that prior to his conversion, of course, Paul, as a conservative Shammaiite-trained Pharisee, would have contended that the only way to participate in the covenant faithfulness of God that had been made with Israel was for all Gentiles to be converted, as it were, to Judaism, to be circumcised, keep kosher, and keep the Sabbath. Those were the three primary regulations. However, if we follow Campbell's chronology, and I think this is where Campbell's chronology really does open the doors for us to understand Paul properly for the first time, we know that the Thessalonian letters, which are written in 41 during the Caligula crisis, they still reflect Paul's being part of this Jerusalem church, James, Peter, John oriented, take the law out to the Gentiles mindset. Paul's still in that when he's writing his Thessalonian correspondence. And we see that because he's embedded in that second temple eschatology. An eschatology which is not reflected at all in the great letters, or the other letters, as a matter of fact, the authentic letters. I do not include Timothy and Titus as authentic in the Pauline canon. Now, when we come to the division between Paul and Jerusalem Christianity, we see it most clearly expressed where they have sent missionaries: to Corinth, to Galatia, and to Rome. Now, Paul is either writing as these missionaries have come to Rome in his epistle to the Romans, or they're about to come to Rome. Both theories have been adduced. However, for our purposes, it's just to note that this major division that occurs between Paul and Jerusalem Christianity between 48 and early 50, and they're sending out missionaries to try and correct Paul's missionary project, to bring it in line with them, to bring it to the truth. They're out there subverting Paul, and Paul will have none of this. And so they've accused him of changing his mind. In Galatians 5:11, in fact, they say, you know, Paul once preached circumcision. This is a term of derision that's used against him. Again, I apologize. It's a term of derision. And Paul doesn't counter that. He doesn't say, I never preached circumcision. But it's apparent that Paul made two major breaks. The first, of course, the road to Damascus, October of 34. But there is a second break after 41 and before the Antioch conference, where Paul's theology shifts quite dramatically. And he lets go of that Second Temple Jewish eschatology and all that goes with it. And he begins to reframe the gospel as an act of Christ for the world. And thus, he begins to perceive the power of the gospel for the Gentiles, and that's us. Without Paul, you and I today would be Jewish. That's how it would work. And there would only be Jerusalem Christianity in its influence. But because of Paul, there is something radically different. And that radical difference is what Paul has to say. I have to communicate with you where that radical difference really is and where we're all in agreement on this. So in the text, he says, I want to remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaim to you. And at the end of Romans, he's going to call this my gospel. This is Paul sharing his gospel, his understanding. And he says, you received, you stand, and through which you're being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed. This is in the same letter where he's having to castigate party adherents. I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christus or Crispus, or however the textual variant reads. The point is, Paul is here saying, look, I birthed you, you're my congregation, this is how it is. And these servants of Satan, the Jerusalem Christian missionaries, could it include Peter? Probably. I think Michael Goulder's thesis on conflict at Corinth holds a lot of water here. What we see is Paul having to challenge this Torah-oriented Jerusalem Christian thinking that has been placed on the Gentiles. And you have to just have an imagination here. You have to imagine the impact of Jesus on these early Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And as Jews, they're going to be faithful to Torah. That's part and parcel of it's the heart of Judaism is Torah faithfulness. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the Gentiles have got to get this through their head, okay? It's the way Torah is interpreted that's the issue for Paul. And Paul makes a rather large leap that his compatriots don't make when he says, the problem isn't simply that there's issues in Torah. The problem is the interpreters of Torah. The interpreters of Torah are the problem. And that's why in his next letter to Corinth in chapter 3, he's going to say there's only one proper interpreter of Torah, and that's the Lord Jesus, the Spirit of Christ. Sadly, we also have lots and lots of folks out there in the Gentile world claiming to have the Spirit of Christ and interpreting the Bible, and we've ended up with absolute nonsense because they've not paid close enough attention to what's occurring in 2 Corinthians 3. But he will begin by noting that he's handed on to the Corinthians that which he received. And both these terms, to receive and to hand on, are terms used of rabbinic passing on of traditions. That is, the rabbi would utter a teaching, the students would memorize it, and that's how the teaching is handed on or passed on. So a particular rabbi might form a particular halakhic formulation. That is, a halakhic formulation would be, this is what the Torah says, and how do we interpret this today? And so they form that interpretation. And in that interpretation, they pass it on. The disciple, the student, memorizes it, and then will pass it on. So that which I received, I pass on to you. And Paul's reminding the Corinthians that when it comes to the gospel, there are going to be things of first importance, primary importance, and he did not fail to pass those on. And so he constructs here a list, or it appears to be, according to some scholars, a bit of a creedal formulation, whether Paul is borrowing it from somewhere, that is from the tradition he's received, you see, and modifying it. I think both are the case. He begins by saying, I hand it on to you as of first importance, primary importance, protos, the first principles, the first things. Here's the place you got to start. This is the package. This is where we all begin. Jews, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. This is where we all begin, Paul says. And he has this almost creedal-like bit that occurs here. He says, Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. That's the first time this is going to be mentioned, the scriptures. That he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. Now, Paul has brought the crucifixion and the resurrection and said there is a way to understand both these events as events that were promised by God. That is, this is how God works and this is how God keeps God's promises. And after the resurrection, you get a list of appearances. You get the first appearance to Peter. Well, that's an appearance that's not contained in the New Testament. No appearance to Peter. Don't know what happened there. Had to be a powerful moment, but it's not recorded. And then he appears to the 12 in the upper room, or the apostles. Whether we're to imagine that upper room narrative at the end of the Gospels or not with regard to this, not so important. But he appears to the 12, to the apostles. And then Paul mentions Pentecost, where he appears to more than 500 brethren at once. And Pentecost, my friends, is a resurrection appearance event. And the verb hopsthei, to be seen by, is used in that text, and that's a technical term for seeing the risen Christ. Pentecost is not just the disciples standing around and all of a sudden tongues of fire hit their head. No, Christ appears to more than 500 of these brothers and sisters all at one time, gathered together for Pentecost. He says some of these have died, but most are still alive. So in other words, you can go check this out, kind of thing. And then he appeared to James, his own brother. Jesus appears to his younger brother, James. Now, we don't have that recorded in the New Testament, although there is an apocryphal story about James who, after Jesus dies, refuses to eat until he should see Jesus. But by this time, if you look through the list, you're already dealing with at least 50 days since the crucifixion. And I somehow don't think James actually lasted 50 days without eating. And then finally, he says, and then to all the apostles. Wait, there are more than 12? I mean, if we follow the book of Acts, there are 12 apostles. And Paul has to spend all kinds of time justifying his apostleship because he was not baptized by the Baptist. He did not follow Jesus during his ministry. And those seem to be requirements for apostleship, at least according to Jerusalem Christianity. And Paul does not do that. And again, I apologize. He says, I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I am untimely born. The Greek term here is interesting, ektroma. It's the only time it's used in the New Testament. And it refers to a fetus that's removed from a womb in an untimely manner before it's fully formed. So it can be used as a term for miscarriage, and it can be used as a term for abortion, although Greek does have another word for the forced miscarriage of a child, of a baby in the womb. It has another term for abortion. Here, ektroma can refer to both, but the emphasis is on the untimeliness of the birth. Second, this term is used as a slur. There are a few instances in Greek literature where to be referred to as an ektroma is to be a monster. That is, you're to think of the baby that comes out of the womb that's not fully formed. It's monstrous in this sense. It's not human. It doesn't look human yet. And please don't bring all your modern debates about abortion in the womb and all that nonsense in here yet. We're talking first century, okay? All right, good. Now, this is what Paul's being called, an ektroma, a monstrous birth, a failed birth, an untimely, out of out of a mess of a child. And Paul says, I acknowledge this is what I am. They want to call me that. This is what I am. I'm an ectroma because I persecuted the church, God's people. Fascinating, isn't it? That Paul should include himself at the end of this list with such a description. But then again, in the letter to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, he's going to refer to apostles in general as prepsema, scapegoats. This is hard for us to understand today because we tend to think of the apostles as these wonderful magic working figures who wandered the ancient world and commanded demons to leave and healed everybody and did this and that and the other. And the early church was one great big happy clappy family with a few minor disagreements, over the law and this and that and the other. And they solved that all in Acts 15. And we have this very fake view of the apostles and life in the early church. The real view is that the early church was loaded with conflict right from the start. There were power struggles right from the start. We can see this in the book of Acts, where between the Pentecost event in late May or early June of 34 through the summer of the following 33, through the summer of the following year 34, evidently the Jerusalem church tries to do a communist experiment where everybody shares their goods in common. And everything's working until we get to Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5, and they don't share. And the next thing you know, God kills them, allegedly. God kills them. You can go listen to the Ananias and Sapphira broadcast that we did at Wild Goose a few years ago on my website for this. But the thing is we move right into chapter 6 and the division between the Greek-speaking Jews and the Aramaic-speaking Jews. There's no happy clappy family here, and Ananias and Sapphira really are scapegoats for the Jerusalem church. You see this? There's no happy clappy time. In less than a year, this whole communist experiment fails. Less than a year. So it's wrong for us to go, oh, look how happy they were in Acts 2, 3, and 4, and then assume that it just kind of carried on. Nope. No, the early church, the Jerusalem church, engaged in some form of marginalization and scapegoating when they dealt with Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5. And Ananias and Sapphira didn't make good scapegoats because just a chapter later, the big division happens. This is all part and parcel of what's happening with the Jerusalem church, because there's another church there that's being formed. It's the Hellenistic Jewish church. We see this in Stephen and his speech, which is very anti-temple. And we see this in the Johannine group or community, which at this time, I think, is still there, part of that Hellenistic Jewish church. They will eventually move to Ephesus and produce the gospel and epistles, but they're part of this group now. They're not part of the 12. They're not part of the James, Peter, John group. And already there's these fights. Is it any wonder then that 16 years later, these fights come to the shores of Corinth? Who has the right to preach the gospel is the question. And Paul says, I do. I'm not denying that you don't, but I do. And so he gives to the Corinthians that which is of first importance, that which they are all preaching. And they're all preaching Christ crucified, Christ buried, Christ risen, in accordance with the scriptures, and Christ appearing. Ding, 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 ding. That's of first importance to Paul. You'll notice there's a lot missing in this, isn't there? There's nothing here about Christ lived. There's nothing here about Christ taught. That's presupposed, I think, in Paul. But Paul, I think, also has quite a different take on the historical Jesus than the 12 who were actually with Jesus. And as the Gospel of Mark reflects, the disciples did not understand Jesus while he was with them. And I think Paul understood that quite clearly. In other words, you could have walked and talked with Jesus for 3 years, and you still would have turned around and betrayed him or denied him and not understood him. You see, historical proximity to Jesus does not guarantee insight. That's the point. It should also be a warning to those of us who think we have some kind of spiritual connection to Jesus. as though we are privileged and guaranteed to understand. That's not the case. So, this of first importance. I preach Christ crucified in accordance with the scriptures. I preach that he was buried. He was dead. He was buried. He was put in a tomb. He wasn't carried away. He didn't swoon and faint. He died. God died for Paul. And he rose again. And he appeared. Now, these appearances themselves are limited in scope. I do not trust people today who say they have seen the Lord Jesus. I don't. I imagine we can have dreams where we see him. We might have waking dreams where we experience a, quote, resurrection appearance. But apart from this list, there are no more apostles. And I hate to break it to all the Africans out there. There are no more apostles. And I hate to break it to the charismatics out there. There are no more apostles. The apostolic office was given in the beginning to lay a foundation. Yeah, to be sure, it's a foundation we're forced to think through because there are two foundations there, aren't there? Jewish Christianity and Hellenistic, Pauline, Johannine Christianity. And the two don't see eye to eye. It is the rejection of Paul and Paul's gospel that has created the most problem for Christianity. And next to that, it is the assimilation of Paul's gospel to the Jerusalem church that has created the second major issue. The second issue can be seen in the book of Acts, where the writer of Acts, if it's Luke, is really doing his best to write a history of the early church about 80 or 90 years after the event, in the early decades of the second century, And in that book, he tries to make Peter look like Paul and Paul look like Peter. He tries to make one character, as it were. The German scholars in the 1950s called this early Catholicism. Well, they were Protestants, of course, and they may well be correct. But the problem is that these two cannot be mixed. But they're both found in the New Testament, aren't they? You have literature related to Paul in the New Testament that's pro-Paul. Not only Paul's authentic letters, Paul is pro himself, isn't he? But the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke. The fourth Gospel shares many themes in common with Paul, including demonstrating that the writer behind the fourth Gospel is greater than Peter, has one up on Peter. So every time the beloved disciple or the other disciple is mentioned in the fourth Gospel, the 5 times that figure is mentioned, it's always in relation to Peter and always one-upping Peter. This disciple in the fourth Gospel has an encounter with Jesus before Peter. This disciple in the fourth Gospel knows the high priest and gets in. Peter doesn't. This disciple's the one in the upper room who sits in the spot of honor next to Jesus, not Peter. This disciple is the one in John 21 who recognizes Jesus from the boat and runs to see him, and then Peter follows. Again, I apologize. I'm not doing well with this head cold. However we want to slice it or dice it, we have to look at the early church as a church in conflict. It was in conflict. It wasn't some little happy, clappy thing, okay? And anybody that tries to tell you that the early church was filled with the Spirit, they were all in unity, they were all exercising their gifts and working together with some minor theological disagreements, does not know history and is not paying attention to the biblical text. But for Paul, writing to the Corinthians, he's saying, look, I may have said these things before, but this is what I know now. And it's that shift in Paul's thinking that has created the problem for him. Do you see? I say Paul's second conversion, that is his insight period, what Doug Campbell calls the silent years, are really not so silent. Paul is discovering what the gospel is between 42 and 48. And as he gets ready to write these letters, and as he's coming back to visit these communities where he's been before, having preached one message, now he's coming back with his new message, the thing that he finally gets. And of course, the Jerusalem church missionaries do not like that. Paul has split from them, and so now they have to go correct his churches. My friends, the reason I picked this passage today is that there are a lot of us who have held a particular theological view for a while, and then our hearts and minds have been opened to the gospel, perhaps Paul's gospel, certainly the gospel. And thus, when we start thinking about things differently and reframing things and building on a better foundation, those who knew us say, "You've changed." And they're right. We have changed. They say to us, "You're not preaching what you used to preach." And they're right. We're not preaching what we used to preach. And they say, "You rejected what you used to preach, and now you're preaching something different." And we have to say, no. The basic primary principles of what we preached before, the death of Jesus, the burial of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, these things are the same. They remain the same. New understanding for sure, but they remain the same. It is up to us to have the courage and the fortitude to stand firm with Paul and the writer of the fourth gospel and the writer of Luke and the writer of Mark and the writer of the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, in this gospel in which we stand, namely, that Jesus died not just for the Jewish nation, but for you and me, the non-Jews. That Jesus was buried, that the liberals are wrong, that he wasn't swooning on the cross and all the other Passover plot theories we've heard, and that he was raised from the dead, and that he was seen. And again, your liberals and your progressives at this point, they just want to go, "Oh, it really wasn't physical. We know the laws of nature don't work that way," and this and that and the other. And I'll tell you, I've never seen more narrow-minded people than liberals and progressives when it comes to how the universe works. Number one, you won't meet liberals and progressive Christians out there that are trained shamanically. You won't meet them. They don't exist. And so they don't understand how the universe works. They don't understand just as you can walk on hot coals, you can walk on water. They don't know how to turn water to wine. They don't know how to heal the sick. They don't know how to cast out demons. And they turn around and they say, "Well, because we don't know how to do it, therefore they don't exist." And that's pretty absurd. It is time for the church to recover the heart of the gospel, and the heart of the gospel is this: Christ has died in accordance with the scriptures. Jesus will exegete those texts in Luke 24 with the disciples on Emmaus. Christ was buried. He was put down, people. They threw his body in a tomb and sealed it with a rock to rot. But 3 days later, that tomb was empty. And that body was transformed. And that body was able to come back into the flesh world, eat fish, be touched, held, handled. It wasn't fake, it wasn't real, it wasn't docetic. And Paul's going to continue on in this chapter, 1 Corinthians 15. And he's going to say, "I need to talk to you about this resurrection business because there are some of you that deny it. And if you deny the resurrection of the dead, you're denying Christ's resurrection. And if you deny Christ's resurrection, you're denying your resurrection. And if you do that, you have no hope." You cannot deny the resurrection of Christ any more than you can deny the crucifixion of Christ. To deny either one is to place yourself outside of the apostolic circle, outside of the circle of the early church, outside of good Christian dogmatics. And I'm afraid in America that most of the progressive liberal theology that I look at today and read online is precisely there. They have walked away from apostolic Christianity. They're trying to create their own. Just as the evangelical fundamentalist reads the death of Christ sacrificially and creates this monstrous thing called evangelicalism or fundamentalism or Protestant orthodoxy, and it's monstrous, people. It's not the gospel. So too our liberal progressive friends have created another monster. And these monsters are battling in America, they're battling in Europe, they're battling all over the world. They're not Jesus. They are not the gospel. To be an adherent of the gospel, to stand in that which we have received, is to recognize that Christ has died for us on our behalf. If you have no doctrine of original sin, if you say that there's no sin, if you don't need a Savior, then be a progressive Christian and deny this all you want. And if you think the laws of the universe are the things you read in scientific textbooks, and therefore you can say Jesus wasn't raised from the grave and there was no physical appearance, you're missing out on more than you could possibly know or believe. And the universe is quite limited to you. It's only flesh. And when the universe is only flesh, it is boring. And that's the real problem I have with liberal, Protestant, progressive Christianity. Honestly, it's just boring. It's just nice, good, Emily, what's her name's values and manners. Oh, let's all be good people, and here's how we're going to be good. And then you bring in the PC police, and they determine what it means for you to be good. And in that way, the progressive Christian becomes just like the Jerusalem church. They bring law back into the gospel, just like the evangelicals they hate so much. You see, there's no difference between the progressive Christian today and the evangelical fundamentalist Christian. None at all. They've both done the very thing Paul rejected. They've brought law back into gospel. That's why for the person on the right in America, it's all about righteousness. And for the person on the left in America, it's all about justice. Those are just two words for the same thing. Law. You see this? Do you see why Paul has to fight with the Corinthians and say, look, I saw something. I know something. This is what was given to me. I have this mission. And I will not let these servants of Satan ruin what God has given me. So yes, the question is, do you believe Paul? Do you trust Paul? That's the big question. Are you willing to affirm his witness, and thus the witness of the entire early church, that Christ died, in accordance with the scriptures, Christ was buried, Christ was risen, and Christ appeared? That is the heart of the gospel. I could mention here that, of course, we could talk about C.H. Dodd and his book, The Apostolic Preaching, and its developments and the framing of the gospel tradition, and how the structure of the gospel is found in these little early creedal formulations that get developed, but we won't go there this morning. We're already long enough. Do you trust Paul? I do. Cheers.